I should have never taken the job. That thought circles my mind every time I think back to that summer in 2013, the summer I spent working at the Henderson farm in the endless flatlands of Nebraska. I was 23, broke, and desperate for work, fresh out of college with a degree in English literature that meant nothing outside a classroom. The economy was still sluggish, and I had no connections, no prospects. When I saw a listing for a farmhand position with free lodging, I jumped at it. It was only for the summer, 3 months, maybe less. I figured I'd save some cash, clear my head, and figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. I had no idea what I was walking into. Henderson Farm sat just outside a ghost town called Blairsville, a place with more empty buildings than people. It was an old farm, its land stretching for miles in every direction, a sea of yellowing cornfields bordered by a dense tree line that felt out of place in the flat terrain. The farmhouse itself was massive but weather-worn, a relic from the late 1800s with sagging porches and peeling white paint. A massive barn stood nearby, its red exterior faded to a dull rust. And then there was the silo, the tallest structure for miles, standing like a silent sentinel over the property. Something about it unsettled me from the moment I arrived. The man who hired me, George Henderson, was in his 60s, a wiry, sun-leathered man with deep-set eyes that never seemed to fully meet mine. His wife, Martha, was a thin, severe woman who hardly spoke. They had a son, Jacob, but I only caught glimpses of him at first, a tall, silent figure who seemed to linger at the edges of the fields, watching from a distance. There were no other workers. Just me. That should have been my first red flag. At first, the work was simple, mending fences, hauling feed, helping with the irrigation. But there were odd rules. Never go outside after sundown. Never, under any circumstances, enter the old well house near the barn. And if you hear anything strange at night, do not leave your room. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to old farmers' superstitions. But then the nights came, and I realized the rules weren't just paranoia. They were survival tactics. The first night, I was exhausted from work and went to bed early. I stayed in the attic room, a cramped space with a slanted ceiling and a single window overlooking the barn. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a low, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the house, but there were no trees nearby. The tapping came again, more insistent. It was coming from the window. My breath hitched as I turned my head slowly. There was nothing there. Just the barn, bathed in the eerie glow of the half-moon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something waiting. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to sleep. The next morning, George found me in the barn and handed me a rusted shotgun. "Keep this in your room," he said, his tone flat. "Might need it." "For what?" I asked, half laughing. He didn't answer. He just walked away. By the second night, I understood. I woke up to a different sound, a slow, deliberate scratching at the walls of the attic. It wasn't mice. It was too loud, too intentional. Like fingernails raking against wood. My heart pounded as I sat up, gripping the shotgun. I wanted to believe it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. Then I heard footsteps on the roof. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the flutter of birds. Heavy, deliberate steps. I held my breath, my body frozen in terror. The steps moved slowly, methodically, stopping just above my room. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I found Jacob in the barn, sharpening a knife. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You heard them, didn't you?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Who?" His gaze flicked to the attic window, then back to me. He hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "They come at night." That was when I realized I wasn't going to make it through the summer. I should have left that morning. Packed my bags, stolen one of the old trucks from the barn, and driven as far from that cursed farm as possible. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. Or maybe it was the way Jacob looked at me when he said, "They come at night," like he wasn't warning me, but testing me. Seeing if I had the sense to be afraid. I wanted answers. Jacob barely spoke to me during the day. He was a tall, lanky man in his late 20s, with sunburnt skin and the kind of tired eyes you expect on someone twice his age. He worked in silence, never complaining, never questioning. I asked him about the footsteps on the roof, the scratching at my walls. He didn't deny it. Just kept sharpening his knife and muttered, "You'll get used to it." I wouldn't. The rules started making more sense as the days passed. The farm operated under its own laws, a set of rituals that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with survival. George and Martha barely acknowledged my presence beyond giving orders. They didn't ask if I was sleeping well. They didn't ask if I had heard anything. They didn't ask because they already knew. On my 4th day, George told me to clear the west field. It was an old plot, acres of overgrown corn that hadn't been harvested in years. The stalks were taller than me, dry and brittle, whispering with every gust of wind. The sky stretched endless above me, cloudless, vast. That was the thing about the farm, no matter how far you walked, you never felt like you were getting anywhere. The land swallowed you. I was about halfway through clearing when I found it. A circle in the field. The corn had been flattened into a perfect ring, as if something impossibly large had landed there. The soil in the center was charred black, the air thick with the stink of rot. Flies buzzed in the silence, thick enough to make the air shimmer. At the very center, half buried in the dirt, was something that made my stomach drop. A boot. Not just any boot. A new boot, half sunk into the soil, the laces still clean, barely touched by time. Someone had been here. Recently. I knelt down, digging into the dirt with my hands. The ground was loose, easy to move. Something was buried here. I felt my fingers catch onto something solid, something soft and yielding at the same time. I pulled. A sleeve. A human arm. I fell back, scrambling away from the shallow grave as fast as I could. The stench hit me then, thick and sour, something between rotting meat and burnt hair. I gagged, wiped my hands on my jeans. The arm was fresh. The skin pale, the fingernails caked with dirt, like whoever had been buried there had fought to get out. I ran back to the farmhouse, heart hammering in my chest. George was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He didn't look up when I stumbled up the steps, gasping for breath. "There's a body," I panted. "In the field." George exhaled through his nose, like I had told him it was going to rain. "Cover it up." I blinked. "What?" "Cover it up," he repeated, slower this time. "Put the soil back. Leave it." I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking. He wasn't. "That's a person," I said, my voice shaking. Somebody was buried there. Someone. George finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, empty of any concern. "And you think you're the first one to find one?" I didn't know what to say. My mouth felt dry, my body suddenly cold despite the heat. He stood, brushing wood shavings from his lap. "You want to live through the summer, boy? You listen to me now." He stepped closer, until I could smell the stale scent of sweat and tobacco on his clothes. "You don't go looking for things that don't want to be found. You see something that don't belong? You put it back and walk away." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that this was insane, that we needed to call the cops. But then I remembered the shotgun he had given me. The way he never asked questions about what I had heard at night. And that's when it hit me. George wasn't afraid. He was used to it. I didn't go back to the field. I didn't touch the body. That night, I locked my door and sat on the edge of my bed, shotgun in my lap, listening. The scratching started just after midnight. But this time, it wasn't on the walls. It was coming from inside the house. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my fingers slick with sweat. The scratching had started at the far end of the hallway, faint at first, like nails dragging along wood. I thought Hoped it was my imagination, the paranoia from the day catching up to me. But then it moved closer. Slow, deliberate, just outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The old farmhouse was always full of sounds, the groan of wood, the distant rustle of the wind through the cornfields, but this was different. This was alive. Then came the breathing. Low, wet, labored. Not human. Something wrong. I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me to run, to get the hell out of there, but George's words echoed in my mind. You see something that don't belong? You put it back and walk away. Except this thing wasn't buried in a field. It was outside my goddamn door. The doorknob rattled. My stomach dropped. I lifted the shotgun, heart pounding, my hands shaking so hard I could barely keep my grip. The scratching had stopped now. The breathing had stopped. Just silence. And then, thump. Something slammed against the door so hard the walls shook. I jumped back, a strangled yell caught in my throat. The door bowed inward, the hinges groaning. I thought it was going to break, splinter apart, whatever was out there forcing its way inside. But just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. A single moment of eerie quiet. Then, footsteps. Not away from my door. Up the wall. I watched in horror as the ceiling above me creaked, the old wood bending under something's weight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It crawled across the ceiling, slow, purposeful, its movements inhumanly smooth. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the shotgun, my back pressed against the cold wall, waiting for whatever it was to drop down on me. But it never did. The house went silent again, like nothing had happened. And then came the sound I dreaded most. The attic door creaking open. My blood turned to ice. The attic door was in my room. I forced myself to look up. The wooden panel in the ceiling had shifted, revealing a sliver of blackness. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it. A hand. Thin. Too long. Fingers curling over the edge of the attic opening, dragging something down. I fired the shotgun before I could think. The explosion of sound shattered the silence, the blast ripping into the ceiling, sending dust and wood raining down. I stumbled back, pumping the shotgun, my ears ringing. Nothing. The hand was gone. The attic was empty. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the hole in the ceiling, my entire body shaking. Then, footsteps. George. He threw the door open without knocking, his rifle in hand. His face was unreadable, his eyes darting between the ceiling and the smoking barrel of my shotgun. You saw it, he said. Not a question. I nodded, still unable to speak. George exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. Just tired. He walked over, grabbed a chair, and stood on it, peering into the attic. He didn't flinch. Didn't react at all. Just sighed and pulled the wooden panel shut, locking it. Don't shoot at him, he said, finally looking at me. Doesn't do a damn thing except piss him off. I stared at him. What the hell are they? George sighed, stepping off the chair. He motioned for me to follow. Come on, he said. You deserve to know what you're dealing with. I followed him downstairs, my legs barely able to carry me. He led me through the kitchen, past the dining room, toward the back door. But instead of heading outside, he stopped in front of a locked door I hadn't noticed before. It was heavy, old, different from the rest of the house. George pulled a key from his pocket, hesitated for half a second, then unlocked it. The smell hit me first. Damp earth. Rot. Something old. He stepped inside, and I followed. Stairs led downward into what I thought was a basement. But when I reached the bottom, I realized it wasn't a basement. It was a tunnel. A tunnel leading deep under the farm. And that's when I understood. This place wasn't just haunted. It was a goddamn feeding ground. I hesitated at the threshold, staring into the dark tunnel that stretched beneath the farmhouse. The air was thick, damp, warm, like the earth itself was holding its breath. George stepped forward, rifle in hand, moving without hesitation, as if he had done this 100 times before. I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. I glanced back toward the kitchen, toward the door that led outside. I could leave. Walk out right now, get in one of the old trucks, and never look back. But then I remembered the thing in my attic, the footsteps on my ceiling. If I left now, I'd never understand. Never know what the hell I had almost let inside my room. So I followed George down into the dark. The tunnel walls were rough, damp earth, reinforced with old wooden beams that looked ready to collapse at any moment. The ceiling was low enough that I had to hunch. Somewhere ahead, water dripped, slow and steady, the only sound besides our footsteps. "How long has this been here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George didn't look back. "As long as the farm." I frowned. Why the hell would someone dig a tunnel under their house? He sighed. "They didn't." I didn't ask what that meant. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. We walked for what felt like forever, the tunnel sloping downward, deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, heavier, until it felt like something was pressing down on my chest. The wooden supports gave way to something older, stones, massive and irregular, stacked without mortar, covered in strange carvings. I ran my fingers over one as we passed. The grooves were deep, precise. Not English. Not any language I recognized. "You feel it yet?" George asked. I did. Something was wrong down here. I didn't know how to explain it, but it was like the air itself was buzzing, like something just beneath the surface of reality was pressing against my skin. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a wide chamber. George stepped inside, and I followed, my breath catching as I took it in. The floor was covered in bones. Not just animal bones. Human. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. Skulls, ribs, femurs, some old, yellowed with age, others fresh. A ribcage, still covered in strips of rotting flesh, half buried in the dirt. "What the hell is this?" I gasped. George didn't answer. He was looking at something at the center of the chamber. I followed his gaze. A hole. It was about 6 feet across, ringed with those same carved stones, stretching down into blackness. There was no light, no sound. Just an emptiness that made my skin crawl. A well. Or something like a well. George finally spoke. "They live down there." My breath hitched. "What?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "The things that come at night. They live in the dark. In the earth. The farm wasn't built on top of this land by accident. It was built to contain it." I shook my head. "You're telling me your family knew about this? And they just, what? Built a house over it?" "They didn't have a choice." My eyes darted back to the well. I swore the darkness inside was moving. Breathing. George exhaled slowly. "Every few years, someone new finds their way here. A drifter. A farmhand. Some unlucky bastard who took a wrong turn." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Someone like you." I took a step back, my chest tight. "What are you saying?" George didn't move. "You think you were the first to find a body in the cornfield?" The memory of the shallow grave came back in a rush. The boot. The pale, lifeless arm. I swallowed hard. George nodded toward the pile of bones at our feet. "We feed them." My stomach twisted. You what?" George's face was unreadable. "They have to be fed. The farm depends on it." I felt dizzy, the world tilting beneath me. "All the luck we've had," George continued. "The rain when we need it. The crops that never fail. The animals that never get sick. We get all that because we keep them fed." I was shaking my head before he even finished speaking. No, That's insane. It's survival. I backed away from the well, from George, from the pile of bones at my feet. How many? I whispered. George didn't answer. How many, George? I was yelling now. He exhaled through his nose. Just one. Every few years. I let out a short, bitter laugh. So what? That's supposed to make it okay? George finally looked at me. You ever wonder why we hired just one farmhand? My blood turned to ice. George sighed. We needed someone new. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I don't remember turning. My body just moved, sprinting back through the tunnel, my heart slamming against my ribs. I heard George curse behind me, the sound of his boots thudding against the dirt as he followed. I didn't look back. I could see the light ahead now, the faint outline of the basement door. I ran faster, lungs burning, legs screaming. I reached the steps, took them two at a time, bursting through the door. Straight into Jacob. He caught me, his hands gripping my arms like iron. You saw, he murmured. I shoved him, staggering backward. Get away from me. He didn't. Instead, he smiled. You should have left when you had the chance. Behind him, I saw Martha step into the room, holding something long and sharp. A knife. George appeared in the doorway behind me, panting. I was trapped. We don't have a choice, George said, almost apologetically. You have to understand that. Jacob stepped closer, his grip tightening. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for the door. Jacob lunged, but I was faster, shoving past him, my shoulder slamming into Martha, sending her sprawling. I didn't stop to see if she got up. I sprinted for the front door, grabbed the handle. Locked. Behind me, footsteps. I turned, chest heaving, as George raised his rifle. I did the only thing I could think of. I bolted for the barn. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. The moment I hit the dirt, George's rifle fired, a sharp crack splitting the night and kicking up dust near my feet. Too close. I didn't slow down or look back. The barn loomed ahead, its massive doors open just a crack, barely visible in the dim moonlight. My legs ached, my breath burned, but I pushed forward, knowing if I stopped, I was dead. I slammed into the barn doors and shoved them open, stumbling inside. The scent of old hay and manure filled my nose, but beneath it was something else, something damp, something rotting. I turned and threw the heavy metal latch shut behind me, locking them out. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the shotgun. The pounding of my heart was deafening in the sudden stillness. Then I heard it, shuffling. Not from outside. From inside the barn. A cold sweat broke over me as I lifted the shotgun, scanning the darkness. The barn was massive, its rafters lost in shadows. The usual equipment was there, an old tractor, piles of hay bales stacked high, but something was wrong. The smell grew worse, overpowering, thick with the stench of wet earth and something long dead. My stomach twisted, a primal part of my brain screaming that I needed to get out. Then I saw the trapdoor. It sat in the middle of the barn floor, wooden, warped, ancient. I'd been inside this barn every day since I arrived, and I knew that door hadn't been there before. My pulse hammered as I stepped closer. The air felt thicker, the temperature dropping as if the thing beneath my feet was sucking the warmth out of the world. The wood was damp, swollen, like it had been pulled from the ground instead of built into it. Strange carvings were etched deep into the surface, twisting, unnatural shapes that seemed to shift the longer I stared. Then I saw the chains, heavy, rusted links bolted into the floor, not to keep something from falling in, but to keep something from getting out. The whispering started. It crawled through the barn, low and slithering, like voices buried under a river of dirt. The words weren't spoken, they pressed against my mind, seeping in before I could even understand them. Let us out. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a coil of rope. The whispering grew louder, urgent now, voices overlapping. We are waiting. The trapdoor shuddered. A sharp, splintering sound tore through the silence as something pushed against it from below. I wanted to run, wanted to bolt for the ladder and climb to safety, but my body was locked in place. A handprint pressed against the wood from underneath, thin, too long, fingers splayed unnaturally wide, stretching like they had too many joints. My breath caught in my throat. The barn door rattled violently behind me. George, Jacob, Martha. They were trying to get in. Another gunshot ripped through the night, splintering the wood, but the door held. I was trapped. Inside, something knocked against the trapdoor again. Harder this time. The chains groaned, straining. I made a decision. I turned and sprinted up the wooden ladder to the hayloft, my breath ragged. I needed a vantage point, somewhere I could see everything at once. I reached the loft and whirled around, aiming the shotgun down. George was still outside, kicking at the doors. The chains on the trapdoor were groaning, the wood bulging upward, something pushing, straining against it. Then I saw Jacob. He wasn't outside anymore. He was inside the barn. I don't know how he got in. I never heard the doors open. He just was. Standing in the middle of the barn floor, perfectly still. His head tilted upward, eyes fixed on me, half-shadowed. And then he smiled. The grin was wrong, stretched too wide, too many teeth, too white. "Come down," he murmured. I aimed the shotgun at his chest. "Stay the hell back." Jacob laughed, a dry chuckle at first, but then it shifted, layered, like there was more than one voice inside his throat. The whispering from the trapdoor surged, rising to a fever pitch. Jacob stepped forward. I pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the blast hitting him square in the chest. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Didn't even bleed. His body jerked slightly, like the impact was nothing more than a breeze against his skin. Then he looked at me and kept smiling. And in one smooth, unnatural motion, he climbed the wall. Not the ladder. The wall. His hands dug into the wood like claws, his body moving too fast, too smooth, like something that had never been human at all. My breath hitched. "Boy!" George's voice bellowed from outside. "Get out of there!" Jacob lunged. I had no choice. I jumped. The air whooshed past me as I plummeted. The ground slammed into me, pain shooting through my body. My vision blurred, my ears ringing. My limbs screamed in protest as I tried to scramble to my feet. The barn doors burst open. George grabbed me by the collar, hauling me up with surprising strength. "Run." I didn't argue. We sprinted for the house. Behind us, Jacob's laughter turned into something else, high-pitched, wrong, and then, worse, more voices joining in. I risked a glance back and nearly choked on my own breath. Jacob wasn't alone anymore. Figures were crawling up from the earth, clawing their way out of the dirt like they'd been buried alive. Limbs twisted, faces blank and stretched, their movements jerky, unnatural. We barely made it inside before George slammed the door shut, locking it behind us. He stood there, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his face. Martha stood at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a rosary, muttering prayers under her breath. I collapsed onto the floor, my entire body shaking. What the hell was that? I gasped. George wiped the sweat from his face, eyes dark. Something we can't let out. I stared at him, my breath coming in ragged bursts. Outside, the laughter suddenly shifted into screaming, Jacob's voice, but not from the barn. It was coming from the attic. Jacob's scream didn't come from outside. It came from above. The attic. The same attic I had slept in for the past week. The realization hit me like ice water, sending a sharp jolt through my spine. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight, every muscle in my body locking up as I stared at the ceiling. The noise wasn't muffled by walls or distance, it was inside the house. George had gone rigid, his knuckles whitening around his rifle. Martha clutched her rosary tighter, rocking slightly, lips moving in soundless prayer. For the first time since I'd arrived, her expression cracked, she looked afraid. And if she was afraid, I knew I should be too. The scream came again, but this time it wasn't just Jacob's voice. More voices layered over his, warping and stretching, turning into something deeper, inhuman. It sounded like it was twisting him, pulling his throat into something it was never meant to be. The walls of the house trembled under the pressure of it. Then, silence. A slow, deliberate creaking followed, the unmistakable sound of the attic door swinging open. I knew that sound well. I had heard it every night in my room, the wooden panel shifting ever so slightly, always making me wonder if it was just the old house settling. But this time, I knew better. This time, I knew something had crawled out. George stepped back from the front door, his expression cold, calculating. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. "You knew this was coming," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. He didn't deny it. The floor above us groaned. Slow, heavy footsteps. Not hurried. Not clumsy. Deliberate. Like whatever had emerged from the attic was in no rush at all. George's grip tightened on the rifle, his body coiling like a spring. "We don't open that door." Martha made a low noise, something between a whimper and a sob. Her fingers worked faster over the beads, muttering words I didn't understand. Another step. Closer. The air inside the house felt wrong, thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin like something unseen had filled the space. My stomach twisted with the same feeling I had in the barn, the same feeling I had when I saw the chains on the trapdoor. Something was coming, something that had been waiting too long. The next step was at the top of the stairs. A shadow stretched along the wall, spilling down the staircase. But it wasn't a normal shadow. It was too long, too fluid, as if it wasn't just cast by the thing above us, but was part of it. It moved even when the light didn't shift, slithering unnaturally along the banister. Martha let out a broken gasp. "Oh, Lord, protect us." I swallowed hard, forcing my body to move when every instinct told me to freeze. I raised my shotgun, training it on the staircase, waiting. I was barely breathing now, lungs burning with the effort of staying completely silent. Then the whispering began again. Low, crawling, brushing against my skin like the words were being breathed into my bones. "You shouldn't have seen the graves." My throat locked. I took a step back, shotgun shaking in my hands. The voice wasn't coming from the stairs. It was inside my head. "You shouldn't have come here." George fired. The explosion from the rifle was deafening in the tight space. The house shook, dust raining from the ceiling, Martha letting out a sharp cry. My ears rang, my vision swam. But nothing fell. Nothing screamed. Nothing bled. George's face twisted in horror as he stepped back, his fingers instinctively reloading even though I could tell he knew it was useless. Because the shadow hadn't moved. Then, it did. Not by recoiling, not by stepping back, but by spreading. The darkness on the wall rippled outward, stretching impossibly far, swallowing the staircase in ink, moving faster than anything should be able to move. I could see something inside of it, something vaguely human-shaped, but wrong, its limbs too thin, its fingers curling like withered roots. Then I saw its face. I wish I hadn't. It looked like Jacob, but not Jacob. His features were stretched, smoothed over, like wax melting in slow motion. His mouth was too wide, his eyes nothing but dark hollows. And as he took the first step down the stairs, I realized something truly horrifying. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was floating. George grabbed my arm, jerking me back toward the back door. "We can't stay in the house." Martha was sobbing now, rocking faster, but George didn't wait for her to move. He pulled me through the kitchen, past the hallway, toward the rear exit. The whole house groaned around us like the wood itself was protesting. I risked one last look over my shoulder. Jacob, or whatever was left of him, was smiling. And then the house went black. The lamps died instantly, the hallway lights snuffed out, and the whole world plunged into a darkness so deep I felt it wrap around my throat like hands. Martha screamed. Then her voice cut off. Not a fade. Not a choke. Just gone. George shoved me through the back door, slamming it shut behind us, his breath ragged. My vision adjusted to the dim moonlight, my brain barely processing what had just happened. I opened my mouth to ask about Martha, but George didn't look back. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on something ahead. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The barn doors were open again. The trapdoor was open, too, and the things from underneath had crawled out. George's voice was grim. There's no running now. The night was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, in the weight of the air pressing against my chest. The farm had always been quiet at night, but this was different. This was absence, a void where sound should be. No crickets, no wind, no rustling corn. Just the suffocating silence of something watching. Something waiting. I barely registered my own breathing as I stared at the barn. The trapdoor was open. The chains that had held it shut were snapped, thick metal links curled and twisted like something had broken them from underneath. The black hole at the center of the barn yawned wide, a hungry mouth in the earth. And rising from it, they came. Not fast. Not scrambling. But climbing, moving with the kind of slow, deliberate grace that meant they knew there was no reason to hurry. My fingers tightened around the shotgun. I could see them clearly now, figures, their shapes stretching wrong in the moonlight. At first, they almost looked human, their bodies thin and elongated, their movements eerily smooth. But as they pulled themselves free from the hole, their true forms became clearer. Their skin was the color of wet stone, slick and mottled with something like scars, ridges running along their spines. Their limbs were too long, their hands ending in curled, root-like fingers that twisted unnaturally. And their faces. God. No mouths. No noses. Just deep, black hollows where their eyes should have been. And they were smiling. Not with mouths, but with their skin, their flesh stretching upward in a grotesque imitation of human expression. Like they were trying to copy us. Like they were trying to understand what we were. A shiver ran down my spine, deep and primal. I had never felt fear like this before. Not when I first heard the scratching at my attic door. Not when I saw the shallow grave in the cornfield. Not even when Jacob climbed the wall like something that had never been human at all. George chambered a round in his rifle, breaking the silence. He lifted it, took aim, and fired. The shot hit the first thing in the chest. The impact made it jerk back, its body twitching violently. But then, it stood back up. It didn't bleed. It didn't stumble. It didn't even react. The thing just tilted its head, the way a dog does when it hears something unfamiliar. And then it took another step forward. George fired again. This time at the head. The bullet punched through, a wet, snapping sound filling the air, but the thing didn't stop. Its body twisted bonelessly, like something moving inside of it was shifting into place. The hole in its forehead sealed itself up, the flesh knitting back together like nothing had happened. George cursed under his breath. We can't fight them. I barely heard him. My heartbeat was pounding in my skull, drowning out everything else. My legs screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. The creatures were moving toward us now, spreading out, their elongated arms swaying in rhythm with each step. More of them were climbing up from the hole, one after another, their unnatural bodies slipping into the night like they had always belonged to it. Then, they spoke. Not with words. Not with sound. With whispers. Brushing against my mind. Crawling through my thoughts. We see you. The voices weren't coming from them, they were inside me, curling through my skull, writhing like 1,000 unseen hands. My breath caught, a deep, stabbing pain driving into my temples. I tried to shake it off, but the whispers only grew louder. We have always seen you. George grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the house. We have to go. Now. I stumbled after him, barely aware of my own body. The house was only 20 yards away, but it might as well have been a mile. I felt dragged down, like the air itself was thicker, like the whispers were anchoring me in place. Then, the first thing broke into a run. It happened so fast. One moment, it was walking, slow and smooth. The next, it was bolting, its limbs snapping unnaturally as it came straight for me. I barely had time to react before George shoved me aside. The thing lunged and took him down. George hit the ground hard, his rifle knocked from his hands. The thing wrapped its fingers around his throat, but it wasn't strangling him. It was just holding him there, staring down at him, its featureless face inches from his. George thrashed, but the creature's grip didn't budge. Then I saw it. Something dark moving under George's skin. His veins bulged, spreading black through his arms, his neck, his face. His eyes rolled back, his mouth twisting in a silent scream. It was doing something to him. I moved without thinking. I raised the shotgun, aimed at the creature's legs, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit low, shattering its knee. And this time, it worked. The thing collapsed, its entire body convulsing violently as the whispering turned into screeching. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed George under the arms and hauled him away, dragging him toward the house. He was barely conscious, his skin still rippling, whatever the thing had done to him still inside him. But I didn't have time to stop. Because the others, all of them, were coming now. Their movements were faster, more frantic, wrong. They were unfolding from the hole, crawling toward us on all fours, their fingers digging into the earth as they came. I pulled George onto the porch and kicked the door open. We tumbled inside, and I slammed it shut, locking it, bolting it, doing anything I could to keep them out. George was gasping, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven bursts. His veins were still dark, but he was alive. I pressed my ear to the door. Outside, the whispering had stopped. The creatures were waiting. They weren't breaking in. They weren't trying to force their way inside. They were letting us stay. For now. Then came a knock. Slow. Deliberate. And from outside, Jacob's voice spoke. "Let us in." I turned to George, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We're not making it out of here, are we?" George didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, his body trembling, his skin still shifting like something inside him was trying to break free. And then, the lights went out. The house fell into complete and suffocating darkness, not just the absence of light, but something deeper, something that moved. It pressed in from the corners of the room like it had weight, like it was alive, thick and heavy against my skin. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands clenched around the shotgun, knuckles burning white as I fought to steady myself. I couldn't see George anymore, but I could hear his ragged, shallow breathing from somewhere on the floor. It was too uneven, too forced, like something was working its way inside of him. Then came the knocking again. Not frantic, not violent, just slow and patient, a rhythm that sent something cold through my veins, deliberate and steady like something testing the space between us. The door rattled slightly with each hit, not from sheer force, but from something pressing against it, gauging how much give it had. Jacob's voice followed, but it wasn't just his anymore. It had layers, too many voices blending together, slipping through cracks that weren't there, filling the room with a sound that was both inside and outside my skull at the same time. "Let us in." I pressed myself against the wall, forcing my breath to slow, but the words weren't coming through the door anymore. They were inside my head. They slithered through my thoughts, curling around my mind like fingers, whispering from places they had no right to be. Another knock came, the same slow, patient persistence. Then, worse, the sound of something crawling. It wasn't outside. It was inside. A dry rasp scraped against the wooden floorboards, something pulling itself toward us through the dark. It wasn't walking, wasn't even dragging its feet. It was skittering, limbs scraping across the ground in unnatural movements, not fast, not hurried, because it didn't need to be. I sucked in a sharp breath, my eyes flicking toward where I thought George had been. "George," I whispered, my voice barely louder than the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. Nothing. The room was silent, except for the crawling. "George," I said again, louder this time, willing him to answer, to confirm that he was still there, still him. A long, agonizing breath finally came from the darkness, but it was wrong, too wet, too deep, too hollow. Then a single word, broken and forced from between his teeth like it wasn't his own voice anymore. Run. I barely had time to process the warning before the thing in the dark moved. Something massive and fast shot across the floor, its presence sudden and suffocating, a shape that didn't belong twisting toward me from places I couldn't see. My body reacted on instinct, shoving off the wall and barreling blindly forward toward where I thought the kitchen was. The house around me warped, rooms stretching longer than they should, the walls pressing in, the space between growing impossibly vast and suffocatingly small at the same time. The whispering dug deeper, pressing against my thoughts, wrapping around my brain like a thick, pulsing knot, urging me to stop, to stand still, to listen. Something brushed my leg. I jumped, nearly slamming into the kitchen table, my fingers finding the counter as I pulled myself up, scrambling backward until I hit the cabinets. My lungs burned, my head pounded, and my body screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. I could hear it. The thing that had been George was breathing in the dark. It wasn't labored anymore. It wasn't human. A wet, deep inhale rattled through the room, slow and steady, a thing with lungs too large for its body, learning how to use them for the first time. The whispering around me didn't fade, it sharpened, the voices threading together into something intentional, something aware. Then, movement. Not walking. Not stumbling. Pulling itself across the floor. I wanted to scream, to rip the sound from my throat and let it loose, but the moment I tried, the whispering took it, swallowed it, buried it beneath their voices. I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. Then, the porch creaked. Not from something leaving. From something stepping inside. I felt it before I saw it, the air shifting, the pressure inside the house changing, like something enormous had just entered the space. The whispering stopped all at once, swallowed in a sudden vacuum, like 1,000 mouths closing in unison. The silence that followed was worse, stretching too long, too empty. And then, the lights came back on. A shock of white seared my vision, my eyes burning from the sudden contrast. For a second, everything was blurred, my mind struggling to catch up to reality. Then the shapes in the room returned, the details filling in, and the house was empty. No figures at the door. No shadows shifting along the walls. No thing that had been George. Just silence. I didn't move. I stood there, the shotgun clutched in shaking hands, my knuckles aching from how tightly I'd been holding it. The back door was wide open, leading to the stillness of the night outside, where nothing moved, not the trees, not the air, not the world itself. I didn't trust it. Something was wrong. Then I heard it. Soft, small, unmistakable. A footstep. Not from the door. From upstairs. My entire body locked as my head turned toward the attic door. The air grew heavy again, thick and suffocating, pushing against me with invisible weight. The whispering had stopped, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Something had let itself back in. And I was no longer alone. The floor above me creaked, slow and deliberate, each step controlled, as if whatever was up there wanted me to hear it. The attic door, which had been shut for days, was open now. I knew it without even needing to look. A draft moved through the house, carrying something stale, something old, a scent like damp earth and things buried too deep for too long. My legs felt heavy, like something had sunk into my bones, whispering to my muscles, "Stay still, don't move, don't run." But I had to move. My fingers tightened around the shotgun as I forced myself toward the back door. The night was still open behind me, stretching out into the endless fields, but I knew the farm wouldn't let me leave. The moment I stepped outside, the whispering would start again, and whatever had crawled out of the trapdoor in the barn would be waiting in the fields, hiding in the tall corn, watching. Another footstep, this time closer. I sucked in a sharp breath and turned toward the stairs. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, pooling at the base of the steps like spilled ink. I couldn't see anything up there, but I could feel it. My pulse pounded against my ribs, my skin buzzing with the pressure of something unseen pressing against it. Then came the voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." It wasn't Jacob's voice anymore. It wasn't George's voice. It was something in between, layered and stretched, warped like an echo from something deeper underground. I lifted the shotgun, but my hands were shaking too hard to aim. Something moved at the top of the stairs. The darkness shifted, bending in ways it shouldn't. A figure stepped into view, tall and thin, its limbs stretched too long, its body not quite solid. It moved like it had too many joints, its arms hanging at unnatural angles, its head tilting in that same, eerie way Jacob had done before. I saw its face. Or rather, I didn't. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth, shifting surface, like flesh that had forgotten what it was supposed to be. But even without a mouth, it was smiling. My stomach twisted, my entire body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The air had thickened around me, pressing in, pulling me down, whispering things I wasn't supposed to understand. I could feel them now, not just the thing on the stairs, but all of them, watching from the corners of the room, from the attic, from the barn, from the soil beneath the house. The whispering rose again, no longer separate voices, but one, merging together, filling the house like a second presence. The farm keeps what belongs to it. The shotgun was slipping from my fingers. My breath hitched, my mind fogging over. Then, a gunshot. Not mine. A deafening crack split the air, and suddenly, the grip of the house loosened. I gasped, my head snapping toward the sound. George was standing in the doorway, barely holding himself up, his rifle still smoking. His eyes were wrong, the veins in his face still dark, still shifting, but he was still George. "You need to go," he rasped. I could barely understand him. His voice was strained, as if it was caught between two different things, the man he had been and the thing he was becoming. I turned back toward the stairs. The figure was gone. But the house wasn't empty. The air trembled, the walls groaned, the whispering turned into something sharper, something angry. The farm had let me in, but now it didn't want to let me go. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I don't remember moving. 1 second, I was standing in the kitchen, and the next, I was tearing through the back door, sprinting toward the fields. My legs felt sluggish, like they were wading through something thicker than air, but I didn't stop. The farm didn't want me to leave. The corn was moving. Not from the wind, from something inside it. Figures shifted between the stalks, moving parallel to me, keeping pace, but never fully stepping into view. I could hear them whispering, their voices crawling beneath my skin, urging me to stop, to turn back, to let the farm take me. "You belong to us now." I pushed harder, lungs burning, vision blurring. The driveway was ahead, the dirt road leading back to the highway. I just had to make it there. A hand brushed my shoulder. Not human. Too many fingers. I threw myself forward, lungs screaming, legs ready to give out. The figures in the field moved faster, closing in on both sides. The road was so close. Then, I crossed it. The second my foot hit the pavement, the whispering stopped. The pressure lifted. The air became silent. I turned back, chest heaving, sweat soaking my skin. The farm was still there, the house standing as if nothing had happened. The barn door was still open, the attic window still gaping. The wind had returned, rustling the corn like it had never been disturbed. But I could still see them. Standing in the fields, just beyond the road, just at the edge of where the farm ended. They didn't step forward. They didn't move. They just watched. And at the center of them all, George. Or at least, what had once been George. His body had changed. His skin had turned pale and stretched, his fingers curling into something else. But his eyes were still his. And for one moment, I saw recognition in them. He wasn't dead. But he wasn't coming back. The whispering started again, but this time only in my head. "You can leave. But you will never be free." I stumbled back, nearly falling onto the pavement. The figures in the field didn't follow. They had no reason to. Because the farm had already marked me. And I knew, no matter how far I ran, no matter how much distance I put between myself and that cursed place. One day, it would call me back. And when it did, I wouldn't have a choice.